The old wooden cabin creaked and groaned as another gust of wind slammed against its weathered walls. Rain hammered the tin roof like 1,000 tiny hammers, creating a deafening noise that made it impossible to think clearly. Helen pressed, her face against the foggy window, watching the water rise inch by inch in what used to be her front yard. 3 years ago, when she first arrived in this remote corner of South Dakota, the gentle creek that ran behind her property was barely knee-deep. Local folks had warned her about spring floods, but nothing could have prepared her for this. The water had been rising for 2 days straight, and now it looked more like a raging river than the peaceful stream she remembered. Helen had packed her medical bag twice already, unsure whether to stay or flee. As the only traveling nurse serving the scattered communities around Pine Ridge, she knew people depended on her. But common sense told her to get out while she still could. The old dirt road leading to town was probably already underwater by now. She pulled her thick wool sweater tighter around her shoulders and walked to the kitchen to make another cup of coffee. The radio had been crackling with emergency warnings all morning, but the signal kept cutting in and out. Something about record rainfall and dam overflow upstream. She wished she had a telephone, but the nearest phone line was miles away. Outside, the wind was getting stronger. Helen could hear trees snapping and falling in the distance. The sound made her stomach twist with worry. She had treated enough storm injuries over the years to know how dangerous flying debris could be. As she stirred sugar into her coffee, a different sound cut through the storm. At first she thought it might be an animal caught in the flood, but then she heard it again, clearer this time. Human voices, children's voices, and they were screaming for help. Helen dropped her spoon and rushed back to the window. The rain was coming down so hard she could barely see 20 feet in front of her. She wiped the condensation off the glass and squinted into the gray morning light. There, in the middle of what had become a rushing river, stood a large cottonwood tree. And clinging to its branches were 3 small figures. Her heart jumped into her throat. Children. 3 young boys by the looks of it. They must have been caught by the rising water while trying to cross the creek. Helen could see their small canoe floating upside down about 50 yards downstream, caught against a fence post. The boys were from the reservation. She could tell by their long black hair and the way they were dressed. Helen had been treating reservation families for 3 years now, ever since she decided to leave her comfortable job at the city hospital and serve the rural communities that desperately needed medical care. It hadn't been easy at first. Many of the Lakota families were suspicious of outsiders, and Helen couldn't blame them. Their people had been let down too many times by promises that turned out to be lies. But slowly, patient by patient, she had earned some measure of trust. She learned a few words in Lakota, respected their traditions, and never charged families who couldn't afford to pay. Now, watching those 3 boys fight to hold on against the current, Helen felt her chest tighten with fear. The tree they were clinging to was already tilting dangerously. The floodwater was eating away at its roots, and it wouldn't be long before it toppled over completely. She grabbed her binoculars from the kitchen drawer and focused on the boys. The oldest looked to be about 12, the youngest maybe 8 or 9. They were scared but trying to be brave. The older boy was holding tight to his younger brothers, positioning himself between them and the strongest part of the current. Helen recognized them now. They were the Thunder Horse boys, Tommy, Robert, and Michael. Their older brother Joseph often brought them to her clinic for checkups. Joseph was a war veteran who had served overseas and now worked with the tribal council. He was proud and sometimes stern, but Helen had seen the gentle way he cared for his younger brothers after their parents died in a car accident 2 years ago. The boys were getting weaker. Helen could see little Tommy's grip starting to slip. The 8-year-old was the smallest and lightest, which meant the current was affecting him most. Every few seconds his feet would get swept out from under him, leaving him dangling by his arms. Helen looked around desperately for help, but she was completely alone. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and even if she could somehow contact them, there was no time. The emergency services were probably dealing with dozens of flood emergencies across the county. By the time anyone could reach this remote area, those boys would be gone. She ran outside into the driving rain, immediately soaked to the skin, The wind was so strong it nearly knocked her over. Helen had to grab onto the porch railing to keep from falling. The floodwater had risen even higher in just the past few minutes. It was now lapping at the bottom step of her front porch. Looking across the churning water at the boys, Helen realized the terrible truth. If someone was going to save them, it would have to be her. Right now. There was no one else. The distance from her cabin to the tree was about 60 yards. 60 yards of fast-moving, debris-filled floodwater that was probably 8 feet deep in the middle. Helen was a decent swimmer, but she had never attempted anything like this. The current was strong enough to sweep away full-grown trees. What chance did she have? But as she watched Tommy's grip slip again, Helen knew she had no choice. She couldn't stand there and watch 3 children drown. Not when there was even the smallest chance she could help them. She ran back inside and grabbed the longest rope she could find, a thick climbing rope she used for securing medical supplies during transport. It was about 80 feet long, which should be enough. Helen tied one end securely around the trailer hitch of her pickup truck, then wrapped the other end around her waist. Her hands were shaking as she tied the knots. Helen had never been particularly brave. She was the kind of person who avoided conflict and preferred quiet, predictable routines. But something about seeing those boys in danger awakened a fierce determination she didn't know she possessed. Before she could lose her nerve, Helen waded into the floodwater. The cold hit her like a physical blow, making her gasp and stumble. The current was even stronger than it looked from shore. Within 3 steps, she was up to her chest in rushing water, fighting to keep her footing on the muddy bottom. Debris swept past her. Tree branches, pieces of fencing, an old tire. Helen had to duck as a wooden board spun past her head. The water was murky brown and filled with mud, making it impossible to see what was beneath the surface. Step by step, she fought her way toward the cottonwood tree. The rope around her waist was her lifeline, but it also created drag that made walking even more difficult. Twice she lost her footing completely and had to rely on the rope to pull her back upright. The boys had spotted her now. They were shouting something in Lakota, but Helen couldn't make out the words over the roar of the water and wind. She could see the hope and fear mixed in their young faces. They were counting on her. 3 lives hung in the balance, and she was their only chance. 30 yards to go, then 20. Helen's legs were cramping from fighting the current and her lungs burned from the effort. But she kept pushing forward, one determined step at a time, toward 3 frightened boys who needed someone to believe that saving them was worth any risk. Helen's fingers were numb with cold as she finally reached the cottonwood tree. The massive trunk was slick with mud and water, making it almost impossible to get a good grip. She could hear the boys talking rapidly in Lakota above her, their voices tight with fear and hope. "I'm here," she called out, her voice barely audible over the roar of the flood. "I'm going to get you down from there." Robert, the middle boy, was the first to respond in English. "Lady, the water keeps getting higher. Tommy can't hold on much longer." Helen looked up and saw little Tommy's arms shaking with exhaustion. His face was pale and his lips had turned blue from the cold. The 8-year-old had been fighting to stay in that tree for what must have been hours. He was running out of strength fast. The current was so strong that Helen had to brace herself against the tree trunk just to stay upright. Every few seconds, a piece of debris would slam into her legs or back. She'd already been hit by floating branches, a piece of roofing, and something that felt like a car tire. Each impact sent shooting pain through her body, but she forced herself to focus on the task ahead. "Okay, listen to me," Helen shouted up to the boys. "I can only take one of you at a time. The current is too strong for more than that. Tommy, you're going first because you're the smallest." "No," 12-year-old Michael called down. "I should go first. I'm the oldest." "Tommy goes first," Helen repeated firmly. "He needs help the most right now." She could see the conflict in Michael's eyes. As the oldest, he felt responsible for his younger brothers, but he also understood that Tommy was in the most danger. After a moment that felt like forever, he nodded. "Tommy, you have to trust me," Helen said, reaching up toward the lowest branch. "I'm going to carry you on my back, and you're going to hold on tight." Can you do that?" The little boy nodded, though his eyes were wide with terror. Helen could hardly blame him. The idea of leaving the relative safety of the tree to venture into that churning water must have been terrifying for a child. Getting Tommy down from the tree was harder than Helen had expected. His small hands were so cold and stiff that he could barely grip anything. When he finally let go of the branch, he nearly slipped right off her back into the water. Helen managed to catch him just in time, her heart pounding with the close call. "Hold on tight to my shoulders," she told him. "Don't let go no matter what happens." The journey back to shore with Tommy clinging to her back was the longest 60 yards of Helen's life. The extra weight made it even harder to fight the current, and several times she lost her footing completely. When that happened, the rope around her waist would go taut, jerking her back toward shore and keeping both of them from being swept downstream. Tommy was brave throughout the ordeal, even when debris crashed into them, or when Helen stumbled and they both went underwater. For a few terrifying seconds, he held on with all his strength and never once complained, even though Helen could feel his small body shivering against her back. When they finally reached the muddy shoreline, Helen was exhausted and gasping for breath, but there was no time to rest. She quickly helped Tommy up onto her front porch, wrapped him in a thick blanket she'd left there, and immediately started back into the water. "Stay right here," she told him. "I'll be back with your brothers." The second trip was for Robert, the 10-year-old. He was heavier than Tommy, but in better shape, not quite as exhausted from holding on. Still, the journey was just as dangerous. A large tree branch came floating downstream just as they were halfway across, and Helen had to duck underwater to avoid being hit. They both came up sputtering and gasping, but kept going. By the time Helen delivered Robert safely to shore, her legs felt like jelly. The cold water had sapped her strength, and she was starting to feel the early signs of hypothermia. Her hands were so numb she could barely feel her fingers, and she was shivering uncontrollably. But Michael was still out there, alone now, in that tilting tree. The oldest boy had watched his two younger brothers get rescued, and Helen could see the fear in his eyes. He was trying to be brave, but she knew he must be terrified. The third trip was the hardest of all. Helen was running on pure willpower now. Her body wanted to quit, wanted to collapse on the shore and warm up by the fire she'd started for Tommy and Robert. But she couldn't leave Michael stranded out there. The 12-year-old was the heaviest of the three boys, and Helen's exhausted. Body could barely support his weight. Halfway across, she stumbled badly and they both went under. For a terrifying moment, Helen thought they were both going to drown. The current tumbled them around like rag dolls, and she lost all sense of direction. Then the rope went taut again, pulling them back toward the surface. Helen kicked desperately, fighting to get both of their heads above water. When they finally broke through, both of them were choking and gasping for air. "Are you okay?" Helen managed to ask. Michael nodded, water streaming from his long, black hair. "Keep going," he said. "We're almost there." Those last 20 yards felt like 20 miles. Helen's vision was starting to blur from exhaustion and cold. Her movements were becoming clumsy and uncoordinated, but somehow, step by step, she managed to get Michael to safety. When she finally collapsed on her front porch, Helen was barely conscious. The three boys, despite their own ordeal, immediately went to work taking care of her. They wrapped her in every blanket and dry clothes they could find. Tommy, the youngest, used skills he'd learned from his grandmother to build up the fire. In Helen's wood stove, Robert found dry clothes in Helen's bedroom and helped her change out of her soaked garments. Michael made hot tea, remembering how his mother used to treat people who'd been out in the cold too long. "You saved us," Michael said quietly, as Helen slowly warmed up by the fire. "You could have died trying to help us." Helen looked at the three boys huddled around her, their dark eyes full of gratitude and something else she couldn't quite identify. Respect, maybe, or wonder that a stranger would risk so much for them. "Anyone would have done the same thing," she said. Michael shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "Not anyone. Most people wouldn't have even tried." Outside, the storm continued to rage. But inside Helen's small cabin, 4 people who had been strangers that morning were now bound together by something much stronger than words. The boys stayed with Helen until the floodwaters receded and help arrived, taking care of the woman who had risked everything to save their lives. By the time the sun finally broke through the clouds 2 days later, word of what had happened was already spreading through the reservation. 3 Thunderhorse boys had been saved from certain death by the white nurse who lived across the creek, and Helen's life was about to change in ways she never could have imagined. The news traveled fast across Pine Ridge Reservation, the way important news always does in tight-knit communities. By evening, everyone knew about the flood rescue. 3 Thunderhorse boys pulled from certain death by Helen, the white nurse, who lived alone by the creek. Some people shook their heads in amazement. Others weren't sure what to think. Joseph Thunderhorse was fixing fence posts behind his house when his neighbor, Charlie Running Bear, came riding up on horseback, his face serious but excited. Joseph knew immediately that something big had happened. Charlie never rode that fast unless there was real news to share. "Your brothers," Charlie called out before he even dismounted. "They got caught in the flood this morning. That nurse lady, Helen, she went right into the water and pulled all 3 of them out. Could have drowned herself doing it." Joseph dropped his hammer and stared at Charlie. "What are you talking about? My brothers are supposed to be checking fish traps near Little Creek." "Little Creek ain't little anymore," Charlie said, sliding down from his horse. "It's a raging river. Your boys got caught when their canoe flipped. They were stuck in a tree for hours before Helen saw them and went in after them. Made 3 trips through water that would have killed most grown men." Joseph felt his stomach drop. His 3 younger brothers were everything to him. After their parents died, he'd promised their mother on her deathbed that he'd keep the boys safe. The thought of losing them in a flood made him feel sick. "Where are they now?" he asked, already heading toward his truck. "Still at Helen's place. The road's washed out, but you can get there if you take the old cattle trail around Miller's Ridge." Joseph was in his truck and driving before Charlie finished talking. The rain had stopped, but the roads were still treacherous. Twice he had to get out and move fallen trees that blocked his path. Once, he had to back up and find another route when a bridge had been completely washed away. All the way there, Joseph's mind was spinning. He'd known Helen for 3 years, ever since she started serving the reservation communities. She was different from most white people who came through their area. She didn't act like she was better than anyone. She didn't try to change how people lived or push her religion on them. She just did her job and minded her own business, but this was different. This wasn't just doing her job. This was risking her life for 3 Indian kids she barely knew. Joseph had seen plenty of white folks who were friendly enough when times were good, but disappeared the moment things got difficult or dangerous. When he finally reached Helen's cabin, the sun was setting behind the clouds. Joseph could see smoke coming from the chimney and warm light glowing in the windows. It looked peaceful and safe, nothing like the scene of a dramatic rescue that had happened just hours before. He knocked on the door, and Helen answered. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and her hair still damp from the day's ordeal, but she smiled when she saw him. "Joseph," she said, "I've been expecting you. Come in. Your brothers are fine." Inside, Joseph found all 3, boys wrapped in blankets by the fire, drinking hot soup and looking tired but healthy. Tommy, the youngest, ran to him immediately. "Joseph, Helen saved us. We were stuck in the tree and the water kept getting higher, and she came swimming out to get us even though it was really scary." Joseph hugged his little brother tight, then looked over at Robert and Michael. Both boys nodded seriously. "She made 3 trips," Michael said. "1 for each of us. By the end, she could barely walk, but she didn't stop until we were all safe." Joseph looked at Helen, who was quietly making more tea in the kitchen. He didn't know what to say. In his culture, when someone saved your family's life, it created a debt that could never be fully repaid. But this woman had done it without thinking about debts or payment or anything except helping 3 children in danger. "Thank you," he said finally. The words felt small and inadequate for what she'd done. Helen shrugged. "Anyone would have done the same thing." "No," Joseph said firmly. "Not anyone. Most people would have called for help and waited. You didn't. Wait." Over the next few days, as word of the rescue spread throughout the reservation, Joseph found himself in countless conversations about Helen and what she'd done. The reactions were mixed, which didn't surprise him. His people had good reasons to be suspicious of outsiders. At the tribal council meeting that week, old Henry Crow Feather spoke up during the community discussion time. "I heard about this nurse lady and the Thunder Horse boys," he said. "It's a good thing she did, saving those children. But I wonder what she wants in return. White people don't usually risk their necks for our kids without wanting something back." Several people nodded in agreement. They'd all seen promises broken and help that came with strings attached. But Joseph stood up to respond. "I've been watching her for 3 years," he said. "She's never asked for anything except maybe some vegetables from our gardens in the summer. She charges what people can afford, and if they can't afford anything, she doesn't charge at all." "That's true," added Mary Black Elk, an elderly woman who'd been treated by Helen several times. "When my grandson broke his arm last winter, she set it and checked on him every day for 2 weeks. Never asked for a penny." "And remember when old Tom Stone Crow had that heart attack?" said another voice. "She drove him all the way to the hospital in Rapid City herself, stayed there until his family arrived, used her own gas money to do it." Joseph listened to these stories and realized something that surprised him. Helen had been quietly helping reservation families for years, and he'd never really paid attention to the full extent of it. He'd seen her as just another outsider doing a job. But the truth was more complicated than that. After the meeting, Joseph decided to do something he'd never done before. He started really watching Helen. Not suspicious watching, but curious watching. He wanted to understand what kind of person risks their life for strangers' children. What he saw over the following weeks changed his perspective completely. Helen treated every patient like they were her own family. She learned people's names and remembered their stories. When old folks were lonely, she'd sit and talk with them long after the medical visit was over. When children were scared of getting shots, she'd tell them jokes and make funny faces until they forgot to be afraid. Most importantly, she listened, really listened. When people talked about their traditions or their beliefs, Helen paid attention with genuine interest, not the fake politeness that most outsiders showed. Joseph began to realize that the flood rescue wasn't an isolated act of heroism. It was just the most dramatic example of who Helen really was, someone who saw people in need and helped them, regardless of the cost to herself. But he also knew that not everyone in the community was ready to accept that truth. Years of broken promises and betrayals had made his people careful about trusting outsiders. It would take more than one heroic act to change minds that had been shaped by generations of disappointment. The question was, what could Joseph do to help his community see what he was beginning to understand about Helen? And more importantly, how could he properly honor someone who had saved the most precious thing in his world, his family? Joseph couldn't stop thinking about what he'd witnessed at the tribal council meeting. The mixed reactions to Helen's heroic act bothered him more than he expected. He understood the skepticism. His people had been hurt too many times by outsiders, who seemed helpful at first. But something didn't sit right with him about dismissing what Helen had done. That weekend, Joseph decided to do some investigating of his own. He started by visiting families around the reservation who had been treated by Helen over the past 3 years. What he discovered amazed him. His first stop was at the home of Betty Crow Dog, whose daughter had been born during a terrible snowstorm 2 winters ago. Betty was hanging laundry when Joseph pulled up to her small house. "Joseph Thunderhorse," she called out with a smile. "I heard about your brothers and that nurse lady. Thank the spirits they're safe. That's actually why I'm here," Joseph said. "I wanted to ask you about Helen. You've dealt with her before, right?" Betty's expression grew thoughtful. "Oh yes, many times. She delivered my little Lucy during that blizzard when the roads were completely blocked. Stayed here for 3 days until the storm passed, taking care of both of us. Never asked for anything except some coffee and a place to sleep on the couch." "3 days?" Joseph asked, surprised. "She said she wasn't leaving until she was sure. We were both healthy and strong. My husband was stuck at work in town because of the snow, so it was just me and Helen. She cooked for me, cleaned the house, even changed diapers when I was too tired. Like she was family. Joseph left Betty's house with a strange feeling in his chest. 3 days was a long time to stay with strangers, especially during a dangerous storm. Most medical professionals would have left as soon as the immediate danger passed. His next stop was the Lakota family who lived near the old trading post. Frank Lakota was working on his truck in the front yard when Joseph arrived. "Frank, I wanted to ask you about something," Joseph said after exchanging greetings. "You've had dealings with Helen, the nurse, haven't you?" Frank wiped his hands on a rag and nodded. "Several times. Why?" "Just curious about what kind of person she is." Some folks at the council meeting were wondering about her motives. Frank was quiet for a moment, then spoke carefully. "My father had diabetes, you know. Got pretty bad toward the end. Helen would drive out here twice a week to check on him, help him with his insulin shots. Never charged us a dime because she knew we were struggling financially." "That's good of her," Joseph said. "That's not the remarkable part," Frank continued. "The remarkable part is what she did after he died. She came to the funeral, stayed for the whole ceremony, sat quietly in the back, showed proper respect for our customs. Then afterward, she pulled me aside and handed me an envelope." Joseph waited for him to continue. Inside was $500, cash. She said it was from some medical supply company that owed her money, and she wanted to give it to our family to help with funeral expenses. I found out later she'd been selling her own medical equipment to a company in Rapid City, sold her own stuff to help pay for my father's funeral. Joseph felt that strange sensation in his chest again, stronger this time. Helen had been selling her own medical equipment to help reservation families. That didn't sound like someone looking for personal gain. Over the next week, Joseph visited more families. Each conversation revealed another story of Helen's quiet generosity. She had driven sick children to hospitals during blizzards, using her own gas money. She had stayed up all night with elderly patients who were afraid to be alone. She had treated serious injuries without question, even when families couldn't afford to pay. But the most surprising discovery came from an unexpected source. Joseph was having coffee at Ruby's diner in town when he overheard a conversation between two white ranchers at the next table. "That nurse lady who lives out by the reservation," one was saying. "Helen something?" "Yeah, what about her?" "You know, she's been writing letters to medical companies trying to get free supplies for the Indian families. My wife works at the medical supply warehouse in Rapid City. Says Helen's been corresponding with companies all over the region, asking for donations of medicine and equipment." "No kidding?" "Been going on for over 2 years, apparently. She tells these companies about families who need help but can't afford proper medical care. Some of the companies have been sending boxes of supplies, antibiotics, bandages, that sort of thing. Helen distributes it all for free." Joseph nearly choked on his coffee. Helen had been running her own private charity operation, using her connections in the medical world to help reservation families access supplies they couldn't otherwise afford. And she'd been doing it quietly, without fanfare or recognition. That evening, Joseph drove out to Helen's cabin. He found her sitting on her front porch, reading a medical journal by lantern light. She looked up and smiled when she saw him. "Joseph, how are your brothers doing?" "They're fine, thanks to you." He sat down on the porch steps. "Helen, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why do you do it?" "All of it. Not just saving my brothers, but everything else. The free medical care, the supply donations, staying with families during difficult times. What's in it for you?" Helen was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the creek that had nearly claimed 3 lives just weeks before. "You know, I used to work at a big hospital in Chicago," she said finally. "Good salary, nice apartment, all the modern conveniences. But I felt like I was just another cog in a machine. Patients were like numbers on a chart. I'd treat them and send them home, and that was it." She turned to look at Joseph. "Out here, it's different. When I help someone, I can see the difference it makes, not just medically, but in their lives. When I delivered Betty Crow Dog's baby, I wasn't just delivering a baby. I was helping bring new life into a family that had been trying to have children for years. When I stayed with your neighbor's father during his final days, I wasn't just managing his medication. I was making sure he didn't die alone. Joseph listened carefully, beginning to understand. I guess what I'm trying to say is that out here, medicine feels like it's supposed to feel. Like I'm actually helping people, not just treating symptoms. And your community has taught me things too. About taking time with people, about the importance of family, about respecting traditions even, when they're different from your own. But you could make more money in the city, Joseph pointed out. Helen laughed softly. Money's not everything, Joseph. I have enough to live on. I have work that means something. And I have neighbors who've become friends, even if some of them are still deciding whether to trust me or not. As Joseph drove home that night, he realized he'd been wrong about Helen from the beginning. She wasn't an outsider trying to help. She wasn't even a white woman doing charity work for Indian families. She was simply a good person who had found her place in the world by serving others, regardless of their race or ability to pay. The question now was how to help his community see what he had finally understood. Helen deserved more than just their gratitude. She deserved their respect and recognition for the years of quiet service that had made so many lives better. But Joseph knew that would require something unprecedented in tribal history. Something that had never been done for an outsider before. Something that would require the blessing of the tribal elders and the support of the entire community. He was beginning to form an idea, but it would take careful planning and delicate conversations to make it happen. The autumn gathering was still 6 weeks away when Joseph decided to approach the tribal elders. He knew he was asking for something that had never been done before, something that would challenge traditions going back generations. But after everything he'd learned about Helen, he felt it was the right thing to do. Elder William Blackhorse was the first person Joseph spoke to. The old man was known for his wisdom and his careful consideration of important matters. Joseph found him, sitting by the river, watching his grandson practice casting a fishing line. "Grandfather," Joseph said, using the respectful term even though they weren't related by blood, "I need to speak with you about something important." William nodded and gestured for Joseph to sit beside him on the fallen log that served as his favorite thinking spot. "It's about Helen, the nurse who saved my brothers." "Ah," William said quietly. "I wondered when someone would come to talk about her." Joseph was surprised. "You've been thinking about her too?" "Old men think about many things, Joseph. Sometimes we see patterns that younger people miss." William cast his own line into the water. "Tell me what's on your mind." Joseph took a deep breath and explained everything he'd discovered about Helen's years of service. He told William about the medical supplies, the free care, the nights she'd spent with dying patients so they wouldn't be alone. He described how she'd learned Lakota words and phrases, how she respected their customs without trying to change them. When Joseph finished, William was quiet for a long time. The only sounds were the flowing water and his grandson's excited shouts when he finally caught a small fish. "You're thinking about the autumn ceremony," William said finally. "Yes, grandfather. I know it's never been done for an outsider. But what she did for my family, for our whole community, it deserves recognition." William reeled in his line and turned to face Joseph directly. "It's not just about recognition, is it? You want to offer her adoption into the tribal family." Joseph nodded. In their tradition, adoption into a tribal family was the highest honor that could be given to an outsider. It meant accepting someone as truly one of their own, with all the rights and responsibilities that came with it. "That's a big thing you're asking, Joseph. It would require approval from all the elders, and the ceremony would need to be perfect. There can be no doubts about whether she's worthy of such an honor." "I understand, grandfather, but I believe she is worthy. More than worthy." Over the next month, Joseph had similar conversations with each of the 7 tribal elders. Some were skeptical at first, but as Joseph shared the stories he'd gathered, their attitudes began to shift. Elder Rose Standing Bear had her own story about Helen treating her granddaughter's pneumonia during a time when the family had no money for medicine. Elder Frank Two Eagles remembered Helen sitting up all night with his wife when she was dying, holding her hand and singing soft songs. The turning point came when Elder Henry Crow Feather, the same man who had questioned Helen's motives at the council meeting, approached Joseph with a story of his own. "I never told anyone this, Henry," said his weathered face serious. "Last winter, when my arthritis got so bad I could barely walk, Helen drove out to my house every other day for 3 weeks. She brought me special medicine and showed my daughter how to help with the pain. But that's not the remarkable part." Joseph waited. "The remarkable part is that she never acted like she was doing me a favor. She talked to me like I was her own grandfather, asked about the old stories, listened when I told her about the way things used to be, made me feel like my pain mattered to her, like I mattered to her." With all 7 elders in agreement, the preparations for the ceremony began. This wasn't going to be a simple thank you speech. This was going to be a full tribal adoption, with all the ancient rituals and sacred elements that such an honor required. Joseph's role was to prepare the ceremonial items. He spent weeks crafting a special medicine bag from deer hide, decorating it with traditional beadwork that told the story of Helen's service to their community. Each bead represented a different act of kindness, a different life she had touched. The most significant item was an eagle feather that had been blessed by the tribal spiritual leader. Eagle feathers were sacred, given only to those who had shown extraordinary courage and selflessness. In their tradition, the eagle was a messenger between the human world and the spirit world, and its feathers carried prayers and honored those who lived with integrity. As word spread about the planned ceremony, something unexpected happened. Families from neighboring reservations began asking if they could attend. Helen had apparently helped people beyond just Pine Ridge. A Rosebud family, whose child she'd treated during a medical emergency. An Oglala elder whose diabetes she'd helped manage. A Crow family whose son had been in a car accident near Helen's clinic. The ceremony was moved to the large community gathering space to accommodate everyone who wanted to be there. Joseph had never seen so many people from different tribes come together for a single event. 3 days before the ceremony, Joseph finally told Helen what was planned. He found her at her clinic, organizing medical supplies that had just arrived from one of her donor companies. "Helen, I need to tell you something. The tribal council wants to honor you at the autumn gathering." She looked up from the box of bandages she was sorting. "That's very kind, but you don't need to do anything special. I was just doing what anyone would do." "No," Joseph said firmly. "What you've done goes far beyond what most people would do. And the honor we want to give you is something that's never been given to an outsider before." He explained about the adoption ceremony, about what it would mean for her to become an honorary member of the Thunderhorse family and the tribal community. Helen listened in stunned silence. "Joseph, I don't know what to say. This is incredible. But you sure? Are people really okay with this? Helen, you saved my brother's lives, but more than that, you've been saving lives and helping families for 3 years. You've earned this honor through your actions, through your respect for our people, through your genuine care for our community." The night of the ceremony was clear and cold, with thousands of stars visible in the prairie sky. The community gathering space was filled with people from 6 different tribes, all there to witness something that had never happened before. Joseph stood before the assembled crowd, wearing his finest traditional clothing. In his hands, he held the sacred eagle feather and the handmade medicine bag. "Tonight, we honor someone who has shown us what it means to serve others without expecting anything in return," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp air. "3 seasons ago, this woman risked her life to save my 3 younger brothers from a raging flood. But tonight we honor her not just for that one act of heroism, but for 3 years of quiet service to our community." Helen sat in a place of honor, wearing a traditional dress that had been gifted to her by the tribal women. She looked overwhelmed but deeply moved by the ceremony unfolding around her. Joseph continued, speaking in both Lakota and English so everyone could understand. He told the story of the flood rescue, but also the stories of all the other lives Helen had touched. He spoke about her respect for their traditions, her willingness to learn their language, her genuine care for their people. When he presented her with the eagle feather, the entire gathering fell silent. This was the most sacred part of the ceremony, the moment when Helen would officially become a member of their tribal family. "We give you the name Mani Wikoni Winyan," Joseph said, his voice thick with emotion. "Woman who gives life through water, you will always be welcome in our homes, at our ceremonies, and in our hearts. You are our sister, our daughter, our family." Helen accepted the eagle feather with tears streaming down her face. The gathering erupted in traditional songs and prayers, welcoming their newest family member. Later, as the ceremony wound down and people began to head home, Helen approached Joseph with the sacred feather still in her hands. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything, for trusting me, for accepting me, for making me part of something bigger than myself." Joseph smiled. "Thank you for showing us that sometimes the best people come from the most unexpected places." Helen continued to serve the communities around Pine Ridge for many more years, but now she did so, not as an outsider helping strangers, but as a tribal member caring for her extended family. The eagle feather remained her most treasured possession, a symbol of the day when courage and compassion had bridged two worlds and created something beautiful. And three boys who had once clung to a tree in a raging flood grew up knowing that sometimes heroes come in forms you never expect.